down so we don't.
Okay. I'll take my BlackBerry off to take off the interference.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank
We're going to go ahead and get started with some just introductions. And then we'll start the formal portion of the seminar. So because we have a pretty packed room and some new faces today, we'll just briefly go around and introduce yourself and your affiliation, and then we'll start the formal portion. So my name is Jennifer Dill, and we do have seats in the front row that people are more than welcome to come up and sit in. My name is Jennifer Dill. I'm a faculty member in Urban Studies and Planning, and I'm going to start with Hannah. And you don't have to use the microphone, Jen. We're not live.
I'm Hannah Capel. I'm a second-year Master of Urban Regional Planning.
Colin Meyer, second-year Merck. Alex Gassi, civil engineering undergraduate. Jesse McLaughlin, civil engineering undergrad.
We'll do this side of the room first.
Josh Fisher, undergraduate community development and urban planning. I'm also a senior.
Mickey Blizzard, Office of Congressman Harold Blumenauer.
Tim Lynch, I'm an AmeriCorps volunteer with the Multnomah County Sustainability Program.
Caroline Ray, Merck student.
Will Elder, second-year Merck.
Jennifer Cruiser, TriMet Community Affairs.
Deanne Sanford, TriMet Community Affairs.
Adriana Britton, TriMet Employer Programs.
Karen Cross, Director of the Westside Transportation Alliance, TMA in Washington County.
Ryan Carter, ZGF, Project Architect for the Light Rail Project, IGB.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
I'm all interested in the MERP program.
Rolando Malgoza, grad student in civil engineering.
Todd Markowitz, PV PlaceMaking.
Mark Santucci, City of Beaverton Planning Commission.
John Cullerton, URS.
David Zegel, Transportation Planner, URS.
Sandra Doubleday, Transportation Planning for the City of Gresham.
Jim Gelhar, traffic engineer for the City of Gresham.
Mary Helen Curry, staff attorney, 1024.
Josh Lander, graduate student in economics.
Trevor Twilley, civil engineer, City of Gresham.
Randy Shannon, Transportation Planning Manager, City of Gresham.
Bob Kellett, Mark Stinson, Fall.
Jay Higgins, Mark student.
Jonathan Horowitz, civil engineer.
Rita Gillespie,
Ray Delahanty, first year transportation work.
Marion Reese, citizen and transportation worker.
John Cleveland, professor of school urban studies and planning.
Layla Amon, Methodist Transit-Oriented Development Program. Megan Gibb, Methodist Transit-Oriented Development Program.
Ivan Perez, I'm a graduate student in civil engineering.
Brian Mason, civil engineering.
Chris Monsieur, faculty member, civil environmental engineering.
Steve White, first year land use and transportation work.
Nicole Austin, Industry Work.
Julia Reed, urban designer, Crandall Orenville. Erin Carter, urban designer, Crandall Orenville.
Dave Trout, TriMet operator.
Kate Denning, Shields, Oldest Johnson.
Sean Hoffman, Institute for Agency.
Nolan Langhart, civil Russell Presser.
Great. Yeah, so John, I'm sitting there. It looks like there's
You can have this chair.
there's a chair in there.
There's a chair.
In here.
There's a chair right here.
There's one up, so there's three right here. There's one for us to but I'm sitting in that one. Okay, so I'm going to wave to get our webcasting started. then we'll start the formal project and get right into it. Okay, there we go. So welcome everyone to the Friday Transportation Seminar. My name is Jennifer Dill. I'm a faculty member here in Urban Studies and Planning and Director of the Center for Transportation Studies. And I help organize this seminar along with my colleagues. John Glebe, Chris Monsieur, Miguel Figliozzi are here today. So welcome everyone. This is great. We have a great crowd. This is a topic of interest to a lot of people. It's good to see you. So I think we have a lot of new people here today who perhaps have not come to the seminar live before. And so I'll let you know that we are webcasting the seminar, which is why I have this microphone, and why on most of the desks in front of you there are microphones as well. And so when we get to the point in the session where you can ask questions, you need to use the microphones and hold the touch button area and keep the red light lit while you're asking the question so the people watching on the web, and there are people watching on the web, so they can hear your question. If for some reason there is no microphone because some of the desks are missing them and a few of them are broken, we have this portable one that Chris Monsieur will hopefully walk around and find you. Since I'm one of the speakers today, I will not be fulfilling that role. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce, sure have a joint presentation here today. I'm going to introduce our first speaker is G.B. Arrington from PB PlaceMaking. And I had invited him to talk about some recent research that he's been doing on transit-oriented developments. And then he in turn said, well, why don't you also present what you've been doing? Because I've been doing some surveying. So we decided to combine, and he has some data on Portland and other places, and I have some Portland data, and hopefully it'll provoke some interesting discussion as well. So I'm going to just turn it over to you right now.
Great. Do I speak into this? I'm already wired. Okay. Well, this is an exciting adventure for me because I had surgery yesterday, so I have the influence of Oxycontin. So, so maybe I'll be less nuanced than I normally would be. I don't know. I don't know if that's possible. So how do we make this thing move, Jennifer? Do I push the mouse? Okay, there. Oops. Let's just go there. I can figure this out.
Usually use the down arrow.
The down arrow didn't move it. So I'm going to start with a paid political announcement just to tell you that PB PlaceMaking is a part of the big global infrastructure company of Parsons Brinckerhoff, and we're a little bit different than that. We're made up of urban designers, they made that slide, landscape architects, land use folks, architects, and TOD experts. We have offices 5 places across the United States, and we work globally. So what we're going to cover today is I want to talk a little bit about TOD and travel, TOD and walking, TOD and parking, and then some implications for transit-oriented development. The nice thing is there's now enough of these built projects that we don't have to talk about the theory. We can talk about the practice and how they really behave. Michael Eisner, the CEO of Disney, once said that form follows parking. And what he meant by that was if you want to create compact, livable places, how you deal with the parking is really important. And performance also follows parking. So we want to create those walkable places, get transit ridership up. We also have to deal with parking in particular. For the Portland metropolitan area, this stuff matters a lot. We have a strategy of a compact region, a compact series of cores. We need to realign our performance metrics around the reality of what's really happening as opposed to what we think is happening. If we do that, particularly with parking, I think it'll make projects easier to do, and we'll capture some of the benefits that we're not capturing. With transit-oriented development, we have an interesting puzzle. We know that TODs behave differently than contemporary development, but there's no definitive industry standards or parking guidance on TODs. Lenders tend to require conventional development ratios in TODs, which means we're parking a project like transit didn't exist. And that's pretty uniform around the United States. It's a little bit tighter in Portland, but typically we park them that way. And then developers tend to build transit-oriented development projects with conventional ratios, in part because they're worried about the guy across the street that didn't park his that way, and well, just for a lot of reasons. So if we want to change getting the benefits of transit-oriented development, we need to also change the parking as a way to be able to deal with that. At a national scale, over the past 11 years, we've invested $75 billion in the United States in transit. If we compared that to highways, it wouldn't sound like a big number. But $75 billion is still a big number. By the way, there's a chair here and a chair here for those that are sitting in the back, and maybe there are other ones, so you don't have to stand the whole time. So if we want to capture that opportunity of the $75 billion that we've invested, we need to think about things in a different way. We know that the market is there to support transit-oriented development. When the market comes back again, it will still be there to support transit-oriented development. There's not much of a development market out there today. But by over-parking TODs, we're losing a lot of the benefits that we hope for. And those benefits are things like less time stuck in traffic, lower housing costs. And so the parking part of the conundrum becomes important. Parking's a huge challenge when we design these projects. It's the difference between transit-oriented and transit-adjacent development. So if you really want to have a TOD, you need to deal with the parking. It's also often financially a deal breaker on projects. These, if we want to go to structured parking, we need to spend 4 to 10-fold more for the parking cost versus surface parking. PB's latest numbers for construction costs in 2008 are $17,500 a space for structured parking. That's an unadorned, ugly parking lot next to a transit station with no embellishments. So if you want something pretty, it's going to cost a lot more than that. $8,500 for a surface space. So these things cost a lot, and if we can have fewer of them, the development cost of doing the development goes down by those numbers. And of course, the walkability and the urbanity of the place goes up. The other part is the travel part of transit-oriented development. And I characterize that as a 5-act morality play. Okay, so the first act is we go out collectively and we adopt a plan, and there's a vision. And the community's all very excited about that. The second act is a developer comes forward and wants to implement the plan. The third act is the citizens that were part of adopting that vision decide that they are opposed to the plan because it has more density than they want and more trips than they want in their neighborhood. The third act is we then compromise, we lower the density, we add more parking, and then the fourth act is that we didn't get the benefits that we wanted. The financial feasibility of the project goes down, and it may not even get developed. And if it does get developed, it's not producing the results that we want. And so part of the challenge is how do we short-circuit that morality play? And in part, I think it's having good data on what the transportation performance really is. So when we meet with the neighbors, when we meet with the elected officials, that we can right-size these projects to what's really going to happen. So in terms of some of the research on TODs and travel, we know from the U.S. Census that people that live in a TOD are twice as likely not to own a car as U.S. households. We know that they're 5 times more likely to commute by transit than other residents in a region. And a big reason for that is what Robert Severo calls self-selection. 40% of the ridership bonus for TODs are because people chose to live in a TOD because they were predisposed to using transit, they already were using transit, they have a job along the route. So that's another one of the key reasons why travel is different in TODs, because people are choosing to live in TODs that travel different than normal people anyway. Not to say that you're not normal if you live in a TOD, but the rest of the region. You've probably all seen this survey data from Metro, but it does a really good job of slicing the Portland metropolitan area essentially into two pies. One is our places with good mixed use, higher densities, and good transit. The rest is the remainder of the region. You can see the differences in transit use, non-auto share, vehicle miles per capita, and auto ownership. You're getting very, very different performance when you mix land use and transportation. Of course, that's all what we hope for. If you look at some of the trends over From 90 to 96, you can see how fast population's grown in the region, how fast vehicle miles traveled has grown, how little transit service has grown, but ridership has increased faster than all of those. And I think that's a really good indication of what happens in the long term. If you start linking transportation and land use, you get different kinds of behavior. Because if we want to do this right, we want to deal on both the demand side and the supply side, which means that we need to deal with both the service and with the land use. Now, everybody likes to talk about Portland, but I need to inform you Portland's not the best place in the United States around transit-oriented development. The Roslyn-Ballston corridor just outside of Washington, D.C. is, at least based on my personal experience and all the research that I've read. They started their TOD planning when the system was planned in 1974, opened in 74. They've been tracking data very aggressively since 1980. They've captured around those 5 stations 25 million square feet of office, 14,400 residential units, 25% of all the housing in the county, 37% of all the jobs in the county. The rail line goes through Arlington County out into Fairfax County. So it's the same rail line serving the same national capital with probably the same proportion of heavily subsidized federal workers that care of Congressman Blumenauer to get to ride transit for free. So Washington has a very, very high downtown mode split. But in Arlington County, 73% walk to transit and 13% drive. But in Fairfax County, where they haven't implemented land use plans, 15% walk and 58% drive. So there's another, I think, very strong example. If you shape land use in a different way, transportation will behave in a different way as well. So what do we know about walking? I mean, one of the things that we talk about a lot about walking is the whole idea of core, center, and edge, and start to think about the walkable precincts. And we typically use a quarter mile and a half mile as a basis for walking. I'm going to show you in a minute why it's important probably not to do that, or at least not to do it the way that you tend to do it by saying that that's all a TOD. The biggest impact is actually within the first 600 feet, and then it stops dropping down. And that's particularly true for retail and office. If you put retail in the outer edge or office in the outer edge and pretend that you're doing a TOD, you can call it a TOD, but it won't have the performance of TOD because you'll get a very a lesser mode share. So when we think about this, we want to think about density and then the quality of the walk environment as big drivers to consider. And that, as I said before, we want different catchment areas for office and retail, closer, tighter. Residential, further. People will walk further for residential. And so there are very different density peaks that if you're doing these plans you should think about in particular. So here's some data on that. This is based on 13 stations across the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. So the data point here is 2005. And the office column is the really interesting one. Right at the station, and that means right at the station, 35% mode split. A quarter mile away, it's 23%. A half mile away, it's 10%. So the mode share literally drops 1% for every 100 feet away from the station. If you look at the next column over for residential, it doesn't drop nearly as much. It's still 31% a half a mile away. And so the implication of that is if you're doing transit-oriented development, put the residential at the edges and put the other things in the middle. Of course, if you can have mixed use in the middle, it's even better. So when we do this, then, again, we're trying to deal with the horizontal dimension from the station and the vertical dimension from the station, and dealing with different gradients for intensity for residential versus employment. These are all from the replanning of Tyson's Corner that we're doing right now, a fairly aggressive 760-acre TOD, but that's for a different lecture. So in terms of the new research that we're doing today for the Transit Cooperative Research Program, we're teamed with Robert Severo, the Center for Transit-Oriented Development, and the Urban Land Institute. And what we did is we took a detailed look at 17 built transit-oriented development projects in the United States. They're all multiple family residential. They are all primarily single use, so these aren't mixed use projects. They're in 4 metropolitan areas, and then we measured their performance against what ITE, the Institute for Traffic Engineers, would have predicted would happen around a TOD. Now, when we look at the ITE guidance, one of the first things that you notice is that it's very suburban, and it assumes that everybody drives. It has 7 observations for transit-oriented development. They're all in Florida, and if you've ever spent much time in Florida, you'll understand why that's not a very good place to have your data points from. Okay, and so what it tends to do is it tends to overstate trip generation for transit-oriented development. And one of the big results of that is, I heard a lot of people here were from Gresham. Well, Gresham has, development impact fees, and if you do your development impact fees based on ITE, you're charging the developer 50% more based on traffic than what is happening in reality. And that's a big number. And we can look at how those things play out. The other part of that big number is, then you're also probably sizing your roads based on that traffic. But 50% of that traffic doesn't exist, so we're building our roads twice as big around transit-oriented development for trips that will never materialize. So we're building in unnecessarily automobile dependency. So these are the ITE numbers compared to the actual numbers that we got. ITE will tell you that a multiple family apartment will produce 6.6 trips per unit. Our detailed counts for TODs yielded 3.55 trips per unit. So those aren't just little differences. That's a really significant difference. So that's a hit it out of the ballpark difference. I mean, it's 50%, and that's a big number. So the places that we looked, we did a case study of 2 projects in the Philadelphia, northern New Jersey area. Those were 27% below the ITE 24-hour rates. In part, it's because their technical term, they have crappy transit service. Very limited midday and evening service, and so primarily oriented around the peak, and the projects tend to be lower density, the new ones that we were able to study. Washington, D.C. Had the very best examples and capture rates. These are the 5 projects that we looked at. You can see they're all suburban projects spread along the Washington, D.C. region. They had the greatest reductions, as I said before. They ranged from 30 to 92% below what ITE projected, and on average were 60% below the ITE numbers. The Meridian and Braddock Park Station averaged, just to put it in a perspective, 1 trip for every 2 units. Okay, that's real different than the 6-point-something trips per unit. Okay, because ITE would say you're going to have 12 trips, and they had 1. Of course, that's the statistical outlier. That's the best example. Don't plan your community around a statistical outlier, but also don't plan your community around ITE trip generation rates. These are the 5 projects that we looked at in the Portland metropolitan area. If we hadn't chosen Kotama Crossing out in suburban Washington County, our numbers would have been a lot higher, but that one didn't work real well as in the data. As you on average, the Portland numbers are 40% below the 24-hour ITE rate. Collins Circle was producing less than 1 trip per unit, so that's over at on Jefferson, about 18th. That's a very dense project, over 200 units per acre. And what we found here is, and I think it's pretty uniform between the other communities, the closer you get to the core, the higher the transit mode share is, and the lower the auto trip generation is. San Francisco Bay Area, these are all suburban examples, all in East Bay, all on BART stations. So 48% below the ITE numbers on a 24-hour average. Montevelo Homes was less than 2.5 trips per unit. In that one, they have a 55% capture rate for commuters by transit, and it's very close to the station. It's 950 feet away. from the station. So it's just about in that 600-foot ring that we talked about before. So then the next thing we did, we said, okay, well, now that we have this data, what are some of the implications of that data? And so what we did is we designed we took an 8-acre parcel and we made it perfectly square, and we designed it for 4 different types of TOD housing: garden apartments, townhomes, a Texas donut, 6-story mid-rise, and I'll tell you what those things are in a minute. And then we had one independent variable. We varied it to the parking ratio of 2.2 spaces per unit or 1.1 spaces per unit. And both of those are arguably transit-friendly parking ratios. The 1.1 is what they use in Arlington County, where I showed you before, is what their parking ratio is, and that includes guest parking. The 2.2 comes from the other side of the Washington, D.C. area, from Prince George's County, from the station area plans there. So try to choose fairly tight parking ratios from 2 parts of the same metropolitan area. So this is what a garden apartment might look like. This happens to be in Gresham, but they tend to be, 24 to 32 units per acre, depending on how you deal with the parking, 2 to 3 stories surface parked. The townhomes, this is an example just outside of the Silver Spring metro station in Silver Spring, Maryland. 36 to 48 units per acre, 2 to 3 stories high, surface parked. The Texas donut is a higher density product, 90 to 120 units per acre. It's 4 to 5 stories, and it gets the word donut because you wrap the building around the parking. And this one has 120-foot bays. The developer here designs the parking first, and then he designs the residential, because the parking is the biggest cost. And to make the project pencil, he needs to figure out how to make the parking work. And then mid-rise, 6 to 120 units per acre, 6 stories, freestanding parking structure usually, or it can be wrapped inside the building. So here are the case studies. So what this does then is it compares on one side what a site plan might look like at 2.2 spaces per unit or 1.1 space per unit. With the garden apartments, by lowering the parking ratio to 1.1 spaces per unit, you can increase the density by 33%. You get an extra 60 units, and you save $98,000 in parking costs. Now, we didn't assume that you could get more open space. That wasn't one of our variables. We didn't assume you could put townhomes in there some type and change the density mix. Again, we're just changing the parking. So this may not be how you'd actually build a product, just as a test. On townhomes, same increase in density, 33%, an additional 96 units, and a $736,000 parking savings. Now, the important thing on these parking savings, these are the net savings, because you had to provide more spaces because you had more units, but you still spend less on your total parking cost. Texas donut and mid-rise, now we're dealing with structured parking, so the numbers go way, way up on the parking cost savings. You get a less of a percentage increase in density, only 20%, but you got 162 more units in the Texas donut, and you saved $5.3 million in parking savings. With the mid-rise, 225 additional units, a $12 million savings in parking. So think of these as kind of order of magnitude, how you lay things out on sites, what the requirements are for open space and setbacks and things like that. In the real world, we'll change all these numbers, but it starts to show you some of the relationships if we just change the parking, how we can get more utilization on the ground. And that has a lot of implications. If you can get 20 to 30% higher density residential, you're obviously going to be getting more transit ridership, and we crunch transit ridership numbers in the report. If you get more units and lower parking costs, you also will get greater housing affordability. I mean, you could use that $12 million on the Texas donut, on the six mid-rise, just to reduce your housing affordability. Or the developer could get higher profits. Or a project that may not be financially feasible also already turns out to be financially feasible because you can make it pencil. So what we're suggesting then is new standards to reflect transit-oriented development ought to result in the following things. Developers need to be charged lower fees and lower extractions. We need to diminish the expansion of roads that are reflected in that. Transit agencies should look forward to getting increased ridership. The public hopefully will pay less for TOD housing, and we can increase density by 20 to 33% around these areas. So the city's changing. We need to change for how we plan for the future of cities, and part of that is changing how we deal with parking. So, Jennifer, that's my spiel.
So I think maybe what we'll do is maybe I'll present my stuff, and then we'll open it up for
Perfect.
questions.
I'll go borrow
I'm
your
gonna
chair.
borrow the microphone.
Oh.
So, transition here. And we're going to have plenty of time for questions. So for the past 2 years or so, I've been working on doing some surveys of people who live in transit-oriented or transit-adjacent developments in the Portland region. And that's why I was going to give some highlights of results from today. And some of these sites overlap with the ones that G.B. Arrington just talked about. But first, let me tell you where I've been doing the surveys. So the Merrick was one of the first ones that we did. That's near the convention center, rental apartments. Then on the Merrick and the Westside surveys were done in 2005. And on the west side, we surveyed around Orenco Station Max, around the El Monica Station Max, and at the Beaverton Round. Residential was the surveying that we did. And then just last year, we did a round of surveying on the east side, including Russellville, Center Commons, parts of the Center Commons, I should say, the market rate rental and the townhomes. Around the Gresham Central Station, we did the Gresham Central apartments, so there's some overlap, and then we did some small townhome developments around there, and then Burnside Station at the Northeast 172nd. So just to give you an idea of some of the developments, this is out at Orenco Station. So at Orenco, we surveyed in 3 areas. What I sometimes call the original Orenco, the Orenco Station that people, when you say Orenco Station, is usually what you think about. It's the mixed-use development that's won mixed-use new urbanist style that's won several awards. These are some pictures up there. Then there's these Club 1201 condos nearby. And then south of the station is an Arbor Homes development that is all residential. It doesn't have the mixed use, but it is actually, a lot of it is closer to transit than the rest of Orenco Station. Around El Monica Station, there are also an Arbor Homes development here, similar style of housing as the other Arbor Homes, and then some condominiums right next to the station. This station area, these are developments that you might categorize as transit-adjacent development because there is not really a mix of land uses around here. There's very little commercial uses to walk to, but it is very close to the station. The walking environment, though, is not nearly as nice for some of these as, for example, at Orenco Station. And I'm not showing pictures of all of these because I think some of you know the other locations well enough. This is the area around Gresham Central Station. So again, this up here, those are those garden style, the Gresham Central apartments, and then these are some of the other developments. So I think it falls in that garden apartment style. But there is also commercial development around this area. So just quickly, because as a researcher, I was got to at least briefly tell you what my methodology was. It was a mail-out, mail-back survey. The only exception with the Merrick, we actually dropped them off. We had the cooperation of the apartment manager. And it was a fairly lengthy survey that collected information about their commute patterns, but also travel for other purposes, both walking, bicycling, and transit use, their attitudes about travel and mobility and what was important to them when they chose where they're living. So it was a fairly lengthy survey. For some of the surveys, at different locations, we sometimes added something extra. So at some of the locations, the Merrick and the Eastsides, we had them fill out sort of a one-day trip log where they said how many times did you go to certain types of locations by certain modes to try to estimate a trip generation rate, though that methodology isn't as nearly as sound as I believe you did actual counts of cars coming in and out, which is a much better way of doing that. All total at all of these developments, 499 surveys, and the response rates varied. The Merrick was the highest, the Westside about 29% overall, and Eastside 26%. And the results I'm going to show you, sometimes we have enough results from a single development to say what's going on in that development. But often some of these were very small. There may have only been 15 units, and if you only get 3 or 4 surveys back, I can't tell you for that one development. So for the East Side in particular, a lot of times I'm grouping all of the East Side locations together because they were smaller scale projects than the Arrington station. So to give you a little idea of who responded to the survey, so who is living in these developments, this is the set from the West Side. And in general, one thing that you'll see is these are fairly small households for the most part, with a few exceptions like the Arbor Station or Arrington Station Arbor Gardens development, which averaged 2.4 people per household. But for the most part, these aren't a lot of households with kids in them. On the West Side, the median incomes were fairly high. And also the vehicle ownership was fairly high, almost one vehicle per person of driving age. And so on the West Side, at least, these were not transit dependent people. These were people who had, economically, they had options for their travel. The Merrick, so that's sort of in the middle because it's technically it's on the east side, but it's more centrally located. Again, this is rental apartment housing, 1 to 2 bedroom. So average household size 1.3, moderate income, and still fairly high vehicle ownership. And then some of the ones that I can single out on the east side, the Center Commons, again, on average less than 2 people per household. And again, this is multifamily housing, so that's what you would expect. More moderate incomes than we see on the West Side, and slightly lower vehicle ownership rates than we saw on the West Side. So those are some things to keep in mind as we look at some of these results. So in terms of getting to work, these are the rates of the percent of the commuters who primarily used transit to get to work. So the majority of the days of the week they used transit. In just about every case, it was Max was the transit that they were using, the exception being the Merrick, where you would also have a fairly high level of bus use as well. But for the West Side in particular, Max was the transit being used, not the TriMet bus. So these rates, you can see in all cases more than 20% of the commuters were using primarily transit to get to work. This is much higher than the citywide rates from the American Community Survey in 2005. For example, citywide residents in Portland, 13% used transit, and in Gresham, Beaverton, and Hillsborough, which is where these developments are located, 7 to 9%. So the rates are, significantly 3 to 4 or 5 times higher in terms of using transit to get to work. Now, obviously, there's some variation, and one thing to always keep in mind is it's not just the transit that's influencing people's decisions. Price of parking is also important. So this is showing the yellow mustard bars, or if someone had free parking at work or school, what share of them used transit to get to work, and the maroon, or if they had to pay to park. So there's a big difference. So price is a motivation. The other thing to keep in mind, particularly on that West Side, 18% of the people who could park free to work were still using transit to get to work. And that's still more than twice as high as Hillsborough and Beaverton rates of transit commuting to work. So even though there's this big discrepancy, you still have higher rates of transit use, even with free parking, particularly on those west side locations. We also asked, because most of these developments were fairly new, so we asked about where they used to live and how they used to get to work, particularly if they were working in the same location. And so we were able to see, did people change their commute mode because they moved to this transit-oriented location. And for the west side, this is what we found. We found that 20% of the respondents did change from a non-transit mode to a transit mode. There was 4% that switched from transit to non-transit, so a net of about 16% shift towards transit. There's some that were continuing to use transit and some that are continuing to use non-transit modes. And here, non-transit includes walking and bicycling as well. But I was focusing on the transit for some of this analysis. This is the results from the west side. The east side, we did not see any net change towards transit in terms of commuting. There were some people who switched to transit, and there were some people who switched away from transit. And that's something I'm going to explore further to see why you see a different pattern there. So the other thing we were interested in was using transit for other types of trips, not just commuting to work. So those yellow bars are the transit commuting rates, and the maroon bars are whether or not they used transit to get to shopping, dining, or services like personal business at least once a week. And the green is if they took transit for any non-commute reason at least once a week. And you can see some differences here. So in general, people at these developments, they're using transit a lot for commuting, not as much for other purposes. But you definitely see some differences. And in particular, I want to point out the Merrick. So that's the most centrally located. It's very close to downtown. It's very close to the Lloyd, it's in the Lloyd District area. And so it's much more accessible and reasonable for people living there to use transit to do things like go shopping downtown or go to movies or go to a restaurant and things like that. Whereas opposed to these other developments, the further are, and I've sort of aligned these, so Arrington Station here is the furthest from downtown Portland, the least, and that's a major transit destination. You see the lowest rates of using transit for non-work purposes. So that proximity to downtown, or it could be, in this case it's proximity to downtown, but just proximity to some commercial center that's very transit accessible, where there's going to be non-commute destinations in a short transit trip, seems to be important if you want people using transit for more than just commuting. But one thing to keep in mind is it's not necessarily all about transit, because the thing about a good transit-oriented development is that there should be a mix of uses. It should be a nice pedestrian environment. It should have some increased density so that people perhaps are walking to other types of destinations. So in two sets of the surveys, we did sort of that trip log, and we can get an estimate of the trips that people made from their home by what mode did they use. And this is where you see a significant amount of walking and bicycling for the residents on the east side and at the Merrick. So in the case of east side, 19% of the trips that they took from their home was by walking or bicycling. And that's a higher rate than you would see region-wide, at least from the last travel survey. So that's significant. It's not all about just the transit use. We also saw the methodology that we used on the west side was a little different, so I can't do the same calculation. But certainly people living in Arrington Station area did say that they were walking to shopping and things like that. The folks at Elmonica Station weren't doing that, and the folks at Beaverton Round weren't doing that much either. So where you provide those destinations within the development, the mix of uses, people were taking advantage of it. And that's actually where I was going to end, because I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time for questions, because there's a lot more data, and I know we'll have a good discussion. So I'll invite GB back up here and open it up to questions, and we can share the microphone up here. And Chris has the mobile microphone, so I'll remind people in case you came in late or you forgot to use the microphone so people on the web can hear the question. And if you don't have a microphone on the table nearby, Chris has the mobile mic to walk around. So, oh, come on. Steve? That's the row that doesn't work.
So be for GB, or really both of you. I've heard from developers that for TODs to be successful, public-private partnerships to help assemble land and to contribute to the costs of structured parking are necessary. Do you believe that's true, or does it vary?
Well, of course it varies. The role that government can play to be effective in transit-oriented development is site assembly and helping with structured parking. But the majority of the projects are done by market response for that. So we tend to, like the kind of program that, say, Metro has here, where they look at the performance of a project and pay for what you get that you wouldn't have got from the market otherwise, and PDC essentially does the same thing. So if I can get more affordability, if I can get better design, if I can get higher density, I'll subsidize that, but and structured parking. But you have to look at it on a project-by-project basis, and one of the strong points that we have made in a lot of our research is, the market's very strong for this, and the market will produce these products without subsidies in most instances.
Hold on just a sec. My tech person is telling me. Oh. Okay, so I'll just hold it here. Okay. Okay. Chris?
You have to ask TriMet. I frankly think that is going to be a very challenging line to do transit-oriented development on, and that you won't read as many success stories about that because it's harder. Jennifer talked about proximity to downtown and major trip attractors, and that line doesn't provide easy access to a downtown unless you want to believe for a moment that Beaverton is a downtown. I will not believe that yet.
Okay, hold on. We're having more tech. How should we do this?
Testing.
Should I hold this farther away?
You should hold it far away and put it on.
Okay, and then okay. But we're both answering.
Okay,
so.
but keep it away from your body. Except don't hold it like this.
Good. Now Beaverton didn't hear the answer.
How about right here? The blue. Yeah.
I was aware that some of the early Bay Area TODs that particularly San Jose had done, they tried to plan their park and ride parking to be shared with their first phase and later phase developments. Any thoughts about how shared parking might enter into this discussion about the right amount of parking?
Yeah, I mean, it's a major part of our practice is helping transit agencies fight with themselves, the joint development department versus the operations department, and figuring out kind of what is the right amount of transit parking and where does it go. Ohlone Chenoweth is an example in San Jose where it's a spur line, and they built lots of parking and they didn't get any riders, and so they converted the parking to low-income housing, and there's two low-income projects there done. Eden Homes and Bridge Housing did projects there. It's very difficult to do that. It's a great theory, and the reason it's difficult is because the parkers believe that they have a vested right for that parking, and then they go to the transit board and they complain that they're losing their parking, and the future residents don't have any vested rights because no one knows who they are. And so, it's just very hard to do. There are certainly good examples. The examples I showed you in the Roslyn-Ballston corridor in Washington, D.C., all those had surface parking lots for transit. There's now no surface parking there. But that's the exception, not the rule, and it comes down largely to transit agency policy and governance. The other thing it comes down to is the federal government has been a completely unfair partner on this for a number of years and required parking replacement. So, for example, at Gateway, where you see the medical center at Gateway, TriMet was required to replace that parking on a one-for-one basis, even though the medical center will provide more parking than the replacement parking. And so there was a shift in public cost to be able to put the parking in structure there that should never had to be replaced. So it's a huge issue, and a lot of times it's transit agencies externalizing the cost of surface parking by putting it on the backs of developers and getting them to pay for their parking and structure. And we're dealing with this all over the United States. It's a big issue.
Well,
you had brought up this notion of self-selection, and I'm curious, if you think about a market response, are you seeing that vacancy rates and sales rates are, I guess, vacancy rates lower and sales rates higher with these TOD developments versus the typical development that you might see elsewhere?
Yeah, well, first, let me answer it two ways. The self-selection information is from work that Robert Severo and Wilson and Lund have done in California from a number of TODs, and they've been surveying and measuring performance on those TODs for over a decade with a number of studies. They have some pretty good data. In terms of how do TODs perform versus other products, if PricewaterhouseCoopers and ULI put out a thing called Emerging Trends in Real Estate, and for the last 3 years they've rated TOD as one of the top investment choices because it tends to perform better than other products because it has locational efficiency. It often has public policy that's also reinforcing it and making it easier to get entitlements, but it's still very difficult to get entitlements for these denser mixed-use projects.
What advice would you have for the city of Beaverton in making it a better downtown? And would that include any advice that you would have about the two highways?
Well, I mean, when we do TOD planning, one of the first things that we try to do is to calm the streets because you want to create a walkable pedestrian environment. And what we're dealing with as a pedestrian is an internal travel budget for how far you'll walk. And if you used half your travel budget to walk across the street, it means that the walkable area of your TOD is half as big as a place where you can just easily walk across streets. So I mean, that's a really important place to start. I think another important place to start, and we wrote a case study on this in the previous round of this research, and so and we're quite critical of what happened in the city of Beaverton because I think there's a problem with transparency in some of their decision making and in their process, and you need to build up an apparatus to be able to deliver some of your product, and Beaverton hasn't done a good enough job of doing that.
I would say add also the residents of the Beaverton Round that I surveyed want to be able to walk places. It's almost as if they want to live in an urban environment. You know, it's almost like they want to live in the Pearl District, but maybe they can't afford it, so they're in Beaverton Round. They want to live in a place where they can walk places and use transit. They can use transit to get to work, but they're not walking places because, you know, the walking environment around there beyond the development itself is not conducive to walking. There's and what can you walk to? Big box retail. And so, you know, you need a different mix of retail and you need the pedestrian environment. But the attitude is there. I mean, they're attracting the people who want to do it.
Yeah, and they marketed that site to people that couldn't afford to live in the Pearl. That was part of the marketing plan. And the project that's slated to go next door on the theater site will help increase that. But when you build TODs, what you're doing is you're building a district, not a project. And I always use the Round as an example of that. It's a beautiful project, but it's a horrific district.
Let's see, in the back.
Just had a question about the 50% overestimation of traffic, and I understand that certainly in the short term, you know, in terms of getting a complex filled up with people, that they may not have that many, like they're overestimating the number of trips, but in the long term, are they still, I mean, do you find that there's still a huge difference between, such a big difference between the number of trips versus the number of projected trips? Like, not in 5 years, but in 10 years or 20 years or something like that?
Yeah, well, a couple ways to answer that. Severos found in the study of TODs in California that there's very little change in mode share over time, so they tend to be fairly stable. I don't know if you have different data than that. And we used projects, particularly some in the Washington, D.C. area, that had been around for a decade or longer. And so they had gone through those cycles that you're talking about. But again, the other thing to keep in mind is you saw that the data is very different between the individual projects. The 50% is the roll-up number. Okay, so not all the projects are going to get 50%. Some are going to get a 92% reduction. Some are going to get a 12% reduction. But what we believe very strongly, and what we're working with right now, is to work with the Institute of Traffic Engineers and the Urban Land Institute to get new guidance on transit-oriented development so that a developer doesn't have to go through a separate process to be able to argue that I should have an exception to the rule, to say this is what the rule is. And so we'll be presenting this data at the ITE annual meeting in August. ITE reviewed all of our methodology so that they couldn't come back later and say, well, you measured it the wrong way. We crunched the numbers the way that they told us to crunch the numbers, because, you know, they're not the enemy. They just don't have the information to do the right thing. And so the lack of data is causing them to do the wrong thing, is how I want to view it.
And I would say I don't think there's a reason you would expect the traffic to go up over time. I mean, assuming that the development is relatively full at capacity when you do your counts, why would people be driving more in the future? And particularly if the other land uses are changing, if transit service is improving, you might expect it actually to get more positive in the future than less positive. But, I mean, that's a way.
You know, we also, for example, didn't survey Los Angeles because we knew we would get bad results. And there's a really interesting study that the LA Times did, building off of some of Severo's numbers that came out last June. And what they did is they surveyed residents and found that which confirmed Severo's research, that a lot of the residents that lived in TODs didn't use transit at all. And the reason for that is that even though Los Angeles has built lots of residential, there's not much office near the transit. And you have to have both trip ends. You know, you can't just have an origin. You also have to have a destination. And so the moral of that story, I think, is really, really important. Just building a whole bunch of residential TODs next to transit projects doesn't mean you're going to get more transit riders unless the transit riders have some place to go.
And I would add also building, you know, shopping, you know, other majors or retail destinations that people might use transit to get to.
Absolutely.
Let's see, more. John?
I have a question about the methodology you used.
Sure.
So I'm assuming that the trip rates were based on number of per unit, per dwelling unit?
What we did is we did pneumatic tube counts for 48 hours. We then compared that back to the number of units. And Severo did, like 10 different kinds of statistical analysis. It's all laid out. And I could have brought his presentation, which is just a statistics presentation, but I didn't think that would be as interesting. Nor would I know what I was talking about. So I'd get in trouble much quicker.
Okay, then I have a follow-up. So the follow-up is, as Jennifer's data sort of bears out, these types of developments are attracting smaller household sizes than, say, the comparable non-TOD or suburban. So if you look at it on and presumably, you know, a certain percentage of the units are not occupied at the time you surveyed it. So on a per person basis, is the reduction as great as we see in these numbers, which at least in the Washington, D.C. area seem really huge. Because there are fewer people actually per unit, and most of them are probably not children.
Well, remember, if ITE is telling you you need to provide X number of parking spaces, and you need to assess a traffic impact fee based on X number of trips, and if those trips don't exist, then it doesn't make any difference how many people are in the unit, because you're being held to a disadvantage for something that you're not producing. We didn't have permission to go in and get occupancy rates or talk to residents. It was very difficult just to be able to get permission to hammer a pneumatic tube into the ground and measure that. But I think that kind of information is good follow-up. But that's part of what I would call the evidence that helps reinforce what our findings are. The fact that we know that car use is already lower, that we know that household size is already lower, we know that transit use is already higher from other data points, and then we were able to confirm that auto use is also lower. So you bundle all that together, and it starts to tell you a very clear story.
I guess one question would be whether, so the ITE rates that you cited are for apartments.
They're for multiple family apartments.
Multifamily apartments. So is the household size in the multifamily apartments in the ITE rate different than the household size in these multifamily? And I'm not, it's hard to tell. Now definitely the places I surveyed where it was more detached, some of the Aranco station stuff, definitely a smaller household size than what you might see in a typical detached single-family home type of neighborhood. So,
you know, the other thing that's really interesting in TOD is TOD residents, on average across the United States, tend to have a higher income than other residents because they're living in new product, and it always costs more to live in something new. Now that would tell you that they might, drive more and behave in a different way, and so that's also interesting in terms of what we know about TODs.
Steve?
Well, sort of looking at the newness of it all, are there any TODs around the country that are actually old enough that you could get a sense that this housing stock is starting to filter down a bit and become a bit more affordable? Certainly one of the concerns with TODs is that it's a pretty pricey thing that not a lot of people can afford, and certainly in Portland we're having trouble getting affordable households in there, and I'm wondering if we just need to bide our time for a little while.
Well, you certainly have a lot of TODs that happened in the 80s and the 90s, and so they're going through different cycles of depreciation. So you're seeing more product. And I think the Portland region has been more aggressive than most places in terms of requiring affordability, but it's a public policy intervention to be able to do that. You've also seen that in places like Montgomery County, in suburban Washington, D.C., where the people that came up with inclusionary zoning, and so they have that. But it's a very big issue. It's a big part of our practice. I was in front of the Austin City Council last week talking about affordability in TODs and what they need to do there. We'll be in Denver next week, and affordability is a huge issue in their TODs. So who are we building these for? But in Austin, it was interesting. Their analysis was that the market can afford to deliver 10% affordability in a TOD, according to their affordable housing advisor working with us. And if they want to go higher than 10%, then you need government subsidy. The council wants to go to 25%, so they are talking about earmarking housing bonds passed by the voters and targeting those to TODs.
I mean, the other thing, getting back to the parking issue, is if you require less parking, that's going to make it more affordable. I mean, because it's going to reduce the cost of the development.
Yeah, there's a whole cost study on parking in San Francisco that indicates, a 10% reduction in housing price by how you deal with parking, but I don't have the exact data in front of me.
You had a question.
A lot of these TOD studies are focused on families or households that are two-people families or one-person families. Has there been any studies on families or households with children and how transit use has impacted them?
Yeah, I haven't seen as much of that. That certainly comes up as a conversation piece more, and there are I'll go back to the Austin example. Austin didn't want to see what happened, as some people would allege in the Pearl, that affordability is achieved by smaller units. And so you get 700 square foot units, and those are the affordable. In Austin, they're requiring that you have a full range of units to be able to deal with affordability because they want families. Now, the other interesting thing that happened at council last week was, some people arguing, well, now you're going to deal with low-income people, and you've already dealt with the high-income people. How about the people in the middle? And why can't we have TODs for everybody? So, this whole issue just continues to play itself out, and we solve one problem, and then somebody hands us a new problem.
And I haven't seen much. As it turned out, we surveyed, and there just were not very many households with kids in these developments, enough to look at specifically.
But there also aren't as many households with kids in America.
Yeah, that's
and
the
the fastest growing family unit are people without children.
Yeah.
And if you look at the demographics, it's really, really powerful.
It's a minority of the households that have kids in them. Oh, actually, you had your hand up first. And then
Josh Fisher, I have a question. What would you suggest to city managers that have done business based on sprawl, and given the current climate on high oil prices and driving costs, what do they do with their built environments, and how would you maybe suggest or to connect the urban and rural better based on your expertise? And this is to either one.
big question.
Yeah, that's a really big question. I'm going to go back to Austin again, because the previous week I was there for the Congress for the New Urbanism, and arguing with some of my new urbanist friends that new urbanist projects out in the exurbia are just walkable sprawl. And we now have a lot of data from actually Western Australia where Peter Newman has measured, and his students measured what trip generation is in some of these big new urbanist kind of projects. And on the front, they have a higher trip capture internally, but their external trips are exactly the same. And so my kind of bandwagon now is that we should stop putting lipstick on sprawl and call it what it is, and that we need to focus more on compact and walkable communities. So if I was a city manager out in some place that's producing, largely single-family product for people that are driving to qualify, I'd be very nervous, and I'd try to figure out how I can get more jobs and more walkable things there. But there's a lot of, I don't know if it's anecdotal data or good data that will tell you that the foreclosure rates are bigger on the edge, that there are more communities in distress on the edge, and that's, and now we add in $4 a gallon gas, and we have a really big problem.
I moved on this one parking ratio of 2.2 spaces. And could you go back over that a moment? Because I thought I heard you mention that was a transit-friendly ratio, and I guess my familiarity is what I used to figure 1.5 spaces per unit was kind of standard suburban multifamily ratio. So I just was.
Well, we use that from Prince George's County in Washington, D.C., and they adopted it. That's what they're using. We actually did the master plan and suggested a lower parking ratio than that, but they chose not to implement that one. And what I wanted was just 2 different data points within a metropolitan area. Bye, Dan.
Any additional in the back, Ray? He needs a microphone.
I guess I'm wondering, considering parking ratios, obviously, the smaller the fewer number of spaces you need to provide per unit, it's going to make each unit more cost effective. But I'm wondering, on the flip side of that, if you have a development that has like 1 parking space per unit, is there an aspect of that where it becomes difficult to attract investors because they think you're attracting a smaller market of people who might be interested in living in the development?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and I would treat for sale product differently than I would treat rental product. Renters are more risk averse; they can just leave and go someplace else. With for sale product, people tend to view the parking space as part of the future sale, And so while they may know that they don't need it, they're worried that somebody else will. So it's harder to push down parking on for sale. Of the 14 projects that we looked at, 13 were rental, 1 was a condominium project. So it's more of a push on the for sale, but there's certainly, you can find good examples in the Portland metropolitan area of projects that have 0 parking for residential and very low parking for residential that are for sale products. So what you also want to do is then look at, well, kind of what's the transit lifestyle of the area, what's the quality of service, what's that environment that Jennifer has correctly hammered you on to say what else can you walk to around there, and those all are really important in terms of that overall environment and what trip use will be.
This is more of a comment than a question. It's a follow-up to this discussion. I'm with the Beaverton Planning Commission, and not too long ago, we made some modifications to the parking requirements in the Old Town section of Beaverton, which is south of Farmington Road, around the library. 0.75 parking spaces per residential unit. Just recently enacted. It's going to be a little while before we see what the actual outcome is, but we have also recently approved 2 townhome developments in that area, in the Old Town area, that look like they're going at about 1.25 parking spaces per unit. So people are building at that level.
Absolutely.
We'll see what the sales work like once they're done.
Yeah, and I think the key is when you reduce parking, you then have to monitor what happens. And it's not enough just to say we're going to have a low parking ratio. You have to kind of go out and look at what is the performance and what's happened with the spillover parking onto the streets and how is that getting absorbed and what's happening. And you still may find that your parking ratios are perfect or you can get them lower. But this needs to be an ongoing monitoring process rather than just doing it once.
Yeah, I had a student last year who did a project. He looked at 5 different multifamily units in the city of Portland that were on the high capacity or frequent service bus routes, so they were allowed to not build parking, and they had all built less than 1 space per unit. He went out and did counts to find out the utilization and also looked at spillover issues, and for the most part found that it was still enough parking and that spillover wasn't a big problem. I mean, that was a sample of 5. Obviously, it's limited, but I think in some locations it can definitely work.
Yeah, the other issue on parking, and this is one that Severo has raised, that in some more research that he'll be doing in California on the same topic, but also parking utilization. So we can see, even if the parking spaces are there, how often are the cars leaving? Well, we didn't get into the buildings to do that because we still may find that people want to have that car, or they want to have 2 cars, but the cars don't go anywhere. And so you may have high parking, but low trips. And so again, as we start slicing these onions, you got to slice them in different ways.
Sandra Doubleday from the city of Gresham. One of our problems is that we require 1 unit per for residential and none for commercial. And our problem is we're getting mixed uses, and so we have the parking for residential, but the street parking, on-street parking is basically used for commercial, and that's where we're coming into problems, not having enough commercial parking. The residential seems to be doing fine, and so we're trying to do more mixed use with retail on the bottom and residential above. Do you have any suggestions for us?
Sure. Another suburban example. A suburban example that's a little bit more affluent than Gresham, but Arlington Heights in suburban Chicago on a Metro commuter rail line. They've done a lot of pretty high-density TOD. They have a lot of restaurants in the downtown. They have a little performing arts center in the downtown. You can see Second City there when it leaves downtown Chicago and goes out there. Commuter parking. And so the city manager chairs the parking management committee. And what they keep track of is utilization for residential, utilization for retail, and utilization for residential. And there's a lot of city-owned parking there, and so they try to adjust the levers to be able to make sure that the different uses have the right amount of parking. And I think that's a brilliant strategy if you have the ability to control the parking, or at least start to look at that and just think of your parking as a district and as a collective resource, as opposed to parking as, for individual uses. And so my suggestion is broaden your look and think about a downtown parking district or a Rockwood parking district or whatever district you're looking at, and start to look at ways that you can deal with utilization on a district basis as opposed to on a site basis.
And I can't not resist suggesting parking meters as a way to manage on-street supply.
Absolutely.
And turnover. And, we had Don Shoup come here a little over a year ago and give his talk about parking and the success of doing things like that in a smaller commercial district.
Yeah, Redwood City, California is kind of an example that lots of people point out to as well, as a city that has done a very exemplary job of managing their parking and market pricing, and it costs more to use the meters in the best places than it does further away. So they don't have one price for parking, they have different prices for parking in different places in their downtown. It's been very, very effective.
So then the parking is for the customers and not the employees. The best spaces, which is often one of the management problems, the source of the problem. Any last questions? Well, thank you very much, and I forgot I should be announcing Chris is going to do
so next week we have our very first seminar on air transportation. So Alan Bender from Embry-Riddle University is going to be talking about long before airline deregulation. So with that, thank you, Jennifer and GB. Now I just have to get pipeline.